Over 300 years ago, the city of Londonderry was the scene of one of the most brutal, dramatic and important episodes in Irish and British history. In 1689, James II, the deposed and Catholic King of England, Scotland and Ireland, launched a military campaign to regain the throne he had lost to the Protestant William of Orange.
James's plan was to take control of Ireland and to use it as a launch pad for his move against England and Scotland. But standing in his way were the Protestant settlers of Ulster, and in particular those behind the walls of Derry, these walls. As James knew, if he did not have control of Derry, he did not have control of Ireland.
What followed was one of the last great sieges in British history. A remarkable 105 days, during which the people within the walls of Derry, the majority of them Presbyterians, suffered bombardment, disease and starvation as they resisted James's Jacobite army. It's an event that has created a deep and lasting legacy in the mindset of Ulster Protestants. People who, to this day, continue to identify with the men and women who defied King James and refused to surrender this city to his Catholic army. For them, the cry of no surrender is as meaningful now as it was when it was first shouted out from behind these walls over 3 centuries ago.
This is the story of that remarkable siege, an event that was at the centre of an epic power struggle to decide not only who controlled Britain and Ireland, but also the balance of power in Europe. An event that has shaped the course of our history to the present day.
It was here, at Westminster Abbey, that James Stuart, Duke of York, was crowned King James II in 1685.
But there was a problem, something that did not sit well with some Protestants in England, Scotland and Ireland. James was a Roman Catholic.
At first, James and his largely Protestant Parliament enjoyed a cordial relationship. But over time, tensions mounted, not least in Ireland, where Protestants were alarmed by the activities of the Lord Deputy, Richard Talbot, the Earl of Tyrconnell, as he restored Catholics to positions of influence in the state and the army. Positions they had lost following Oliver Cromwell's conquest of Ireland in the early 1650s. Placing such power in Catholic hands was particularly unwelcome amongst the Protestants of Ulster, many of whom had settled there during the Scottish and English plantations of the early 17th century.
But then something happened that dramatically intensified Protestant fears. In 1688, James's wife gave birth to their first son. Now there was not only a Catholic on the throne, but a Catholic heir to replace him.
You then have a situation where the Anglican nobility, the people who are really running the country, are concerned that the whole Protestant ascendancy that has prevailed since the reign of Henry VIII is going to be overturned.
A Catholic succession to the throne is the straw that breaks the camel's back, and it is after this that a prominent, if you like, cabal of leading political figure and military figures, religious figures, petition William to effectively invade the kingdom.
The plan to replace James with William of Orange, the leader of the United Provinces, or the Dutch Republic as it was also known, was nothing short of a coup d'etat. Indeed, it was to become known as the Glorious Revolution. But the fact that William was married to James's daughter Mary made the decision to invite him to become their king more palatable for some tender English consciences.
For William, it was an appealing invitation. Already at war with Louis XIV of France, he believed that if he could become King of England and turn England against France, he could force Louis to abandon his expansionist plans.
And so, on the 5th of November 1688, William and a force of 21,000 men sailed from their Dutch ports and landed at the small fishing town of Torbay in Devon. It was a momentous step in a European-wide struggle, one in which Ireland was about to play a central role.
Ireland's strategic importance was that it was the back door to Great Britain. William III can't afford to take his glance off Ireland. He has got to solve the military problem in Ireland before he can turn his full attention to England.
In Ireland itself, tension was mounting. Richard Talbot, the Earl of Tyrconnell, knew that Protestants, particularly those in Ulster, could not be trusted to support King James. Likewise, the Protestants had become increasingly anxious over the preceding years, because as they saw it, Talbot had been busily dismantling their power base.
The situation deteriorated further on the 3rd of December 1688 with the discovery, just down there in the County Down village of Cumber, of a letter addressed to a Protestant nobleman.
What became known as the Cumber Letter warned of a massacre of Protestants by the native Irish to take place in a few days' time. On the 9th of December it said, "All our Irishmen through Ireland is sworn to fall on, to kill and murder man, wife and child."
The Cumber Letter is a bit like, you know, the smoking gun or the sexed up dossier. You know, this is a veiled threat that Protestants will be massacred. And of course, Protestants had been massacred in large numbers in the lifetime of many people who were still living. And that massacre, the 1641 rebellion, would sear itself into the psyche of Protestant Ireland. So a letter like that had an enormous propagandist, if you like, effect.
Each side in this struggle uses whatever propaganda is available to them, and the Cumber Letter is used to motivate the settlers, to remind them of what happened before and remind them how precarious their situation is.
The letter is now thought to be a fake, but at the time Ulster Protestants believed it to be genuine, and not surprisingly, it spread panic and fear among them now.
Meanwhile, Talbot was anxious to ensure that Ulster remained under the control of the Jacobite army, named from the Latin for James, Jacobus. Central to this was Derry. It was a city of great strategic importance, and it was largely populated by Scots settlers. Desperate to avoid any trouble from them, Talbot arranged for Derry's military garrison to be replaced by a regiment of Scottish Highlanders and Antrim Glensmen known as the Redshanks. As Catholics, their loyalty to James was unquestionable.
But news of the Cumber Letter, with its apparent threat to Protestants, reached Derry before the Redshanks did.
When the Redshanks arrive, I mean, they arrive too late. They arrive on the east bank of the Foyle, and remember, if you think back to the Cumber Letter, here might be the instrument of our slaughter. And if you looked across and saw these soldiers here, no matter who you are, you would have fears about, should we let these people into the city? What would happen when they're allowed in this city? Once they're in, you can't get them back out again.
Arguments over what to do raged within the city. The Anglican bishop, Ezekiel Hopkins, urged that the Redshanks be admitted, since they were James's soldiers and James was still their king. But the Presbyterian minister, James Gordon, insisted that the gates be locked immediately. Eventually, 13 apprentices took decisive action. They rushed to Ferry Quay Gate and slammed shut the gates in the faces of the king's men.
They're the youth of the city in many ways, and they're the people who take the lead in disturbances in the city, who don't agree with what's happening at a higher level, what the elite are doing. They've seen, some of the elite trying to leave. They feel that they're left on their own, and they take matters into their own hands.
In terms of that period, this is a very, very major step for anybody to take. And it's a step from which most people at the time would have felt there was no going back. This was open rebellion, and it was inviting the king's anger and the king's vengeance.
In Dublin, Talbot, the Earl of Tyrconnell, was infuriated by these events.
And his mood did not improve, for within a week the Williamite garrison of Enniskillen also resisted a Jacobite attempt to take over their town. For Talbot and James, it was all going horribly wrong.
Back in England, James realised that he had little chance of defeating the Williamite army that had landed in Devon in early November. He knew it would be better to live to fight another day. And so just 7 weeks later, on the 23rd of December 1688, he escaped to France and into the welcoming arms of his cousin and ally, the Sun King, Louis XIV. With Louis's support, James put together a plan to regain his throne. And it was not a complicated plan. He knew he could rely on support in Catholic Ireland, still under the control of Tyrconnell. And he also knew that if he could hold Ireland, he could use it as a launch pad to move against England and Scotland and march on London. William and Mary were about to be crowned King and Queen of England. But according to James's plan, theirs would be a short-lived reign. The fly in James's ointment was, of course, the Ulster Protestant. By now, the Presbyterians of Derry had declared their support for William, and under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Lundy, they prepared their defences against the looming Jacobite threat.
Lundy does his best. They know that this could break out on the war. They begin building ravelins. Lundy does his job as a soldier.
Lundy expends a tremendous amount of energy over the next few months preparing the city for the siege. And one thing must be said, it would never have survived the siege had it not been for Lundy's preparations.
By now, the Jacobite campaign was gathering pace. On the 12th of March, James landed at Kinsale in County Cork, accompanied by several French generals and 5,000 of their men. They were to join a loyal Irish army of 50,000 soldiers and irregulars. In addition to these men were the Jacobite soldiers under the command of Lieutenant General Richard Hamilton. They were already on their way north, determined to subdue Derry's rebels.
2 days after James's landing at Kinsale, here in the village of Dromore, County Down, they secured a decisive victory. The so-called break, or rout of Dromore, before going on to take Lisburn, Belfast, and then sweeping across most of Ulster.
Worried at the speed of the Jacobite advance, Lundy ordered retreats from Monaghan, Cavan, Dungannon and Coleraine, and the roads to Derry filled with Protestant refugees. By the 14th of April, James's generals Hamilton and Pusignan had reached Strabane, just 15 miles from Derry. But to march on the city itself, they had to cross to the west bank of the River Foyle. They planned to do that where the Foyle begins, through the joining of two other rivers, the Mourne and the Finn. Once across, they could march down the west bank of the Foyle and seize Derry.
With 7,000 to 10,000 men under his command, Lundy decided to defend the fords here on the River Finn.
But he made a series of catastrophic mistakes that enabled the Jacobites to push across the river at Lifford and here at Claddy, where Hamilton and his men, even though they were vastly outnumbered, met little resistance from the Williamites.
The Williamites were now in flight, pursued by a small number of Jacobites. Lundy ordered a general retreat to Derry. For the Jacobites, the way was now clear to the city.
By now, James had joined his army in the north, and on the 18th of April, he watched as his men encircled Derry. His hope was that such a massive show of strength was all it would take to persuade the people behind its walls to surrender.
James didn't appreciate the amount of enmity that had been created in Ulster, particularly by the acts of Tyrconnell. He was still under the impression that people regarded him as their rightful monarch, and that because the king had taken the trouble to come here, that they would come to their senses, and we can all settle down to the business of being a good king and good subjects once again, while James carries on trying to regain control of Scotland and of England as well.
James then rode up to the city here at Bishopsgate to offer his terms of surrender. They included the defenders' lives, estates, religion, and a free pardon for all past offences.
But in a remarkable act of treason, the guards on duty fired on James and his troops.
It's almost inevitable that there was confusion. And part of the confusion was that James did not realise that an agreement had been made between the defenders of the city and the leader of the Jacobite army, Lieutenant General Richard Hamilton, that no Jacobite troops would approach the city. What the defenders saw was an act of treachery. They had this agreement. Here was the king himself breaking the agreement. They couldn't conceive of a situation in which the king wasn't aware that the agreement had been made. And so James literally rides straight into a storm of anger.
Well, if closing the gates is treason, they opened fire on, and this is definitely treason. But there was probably an expectation too that once the king arrived, his presence alone would induce them to change their minds. And I would say it came as quite a big shock to James. This was not going to be as easy as he thought.
Inside the walls, however, Lundy and his council had agreed they had no alternative but to surrender to James. But not everyone accepted this. In particular, a young Ulster Scots officer, Adam Murray. He and his men distrusted James and were in no mood for handing the city over to him.
In a showdown, Murray accused Lundy of gross neglect for failing to secure the fords on the River Finn, and urged him to fight on and defend Derry. Lundy declined, and in doing so lost the support of the people and his control of the city. He also secured his reputation in history as a traitor to the cause.
Lundy's reputation as a traitor is totally unfounded. Lundy was the man who saved the city from being overrun by a Jacobite army. Lundy is the man who thwarted James's ambition to use the city to move off to Scotland, to move eventually down to London, and to regain his 3 thrones.
With Derry now in Murray's hands, his message to the people was a simple one: no surrender.
James had arrived that morning expecting Derry's surrender. Instead, he had been fired upon and humiliated. Now, after a standoff that had lasted 4 months, since the city's gates had been closed by the apprentice boys, the siege itself was about to begin.
After the bravura of firing on James and their shouts of no surrender, the Williamites now had to face reality. They were surrounded, and they had to defend themselves against what they saw as the might of the Jacobite army.
New governors were needed, and urgently. Lundy was finished, threatened with hanging, and left lurking in his chamber. Murray, the people's hero, was the popular choice for governor, but he refused, preferring to remain a soldier.
Adam Murray comes into the picture, and the citizens of the city want him to become the governor. He refuses. He prefers to serve rather than to lead. And throughout the siege, Murray does come out as a man of tremendous leadership skills, a man who attracts people, a man who is a born leader, because we don't really know if he had any military experience beforehand. But like a few others in history, he seems to have that innate ability to lead people and to lead them successfully.
After Murray stepped aside, Henry Baker, a professional soldier from County Louth, and George Walker, an Anglican clergyman from County Tyrone, were elected as joint governors of the city. They quickly agreed a defence plan, organised 7,000 soldiers and 340 officers into regiments, surveyed the stores, and set the weekly ration.
The new governors were in a dire situation, but they were about to receive help from the most unlikely of sources. Encouraged by a Jacobite offer of protection, about 10,000 people fled the city over the next few days, leaving about 20,000 inside. The Jacobites had hoped to gain intelligence from these refugees, but they gained nothing. Instead, they had aided the rebels, for with fewer mouths to feed, the garrison's food supplies would now stretch further.
Outside the walls, James was in no mood to hang around for the fight. He departed for Dublin, leaving the French Lieutenant Generals Maumont and Puissignon in charge, and with clear orders to take Derry. Maumont quickly surrounded the city with 16 infantry regiments and established a gun post in Strong's Orchard on the east bank of the Foyle. With an army of 21,000 men, it seemed as if the Jacobites would be irresistible. In contrast, Governor Walker's account of the siege paints a depressing picture of the scene inside the city at this time. He laments the lack of food, horses, artillery expertise, and the fact that there was not a gun well mounted in the whole town.
But things were not as clear-cut as they seemed. The Jacobites may have had more men, but not all their regiments were up to full strength. Hundreds were deployed foraging for food, while others were tied up defending the Jacobites' vulnerable southern flank against attack by Enniskillen's Williamites.
This meant the actual Jacobite fighting force was more likely 10,000 men, with 7,000 on the west bank and the rest on the east bank. At the same time, the Jacobite infantry were poorly trained, lacked discipline, and many were armed with pikes rather than muskets. But most crucially, the Jacobites lacked the heavy weaponry essential for besieging a walled town. They had only a few light cannon and some mortars. Artillery that was capable of inflicting considerable damage and fear within Derry, but incapable of making a breach in the city's walls.
The Irish Jacobites certainly have enthusiasm. They're not particularly well led. They are poorly armed. That lack of armament, that lack of discipline is uncovered in the starkest way in what is the debacle of Derry.
The truth was, the Jacobites had come north believing that the mere sight of their forces would shock and awe Derry into surrender. It had never occurred to them that this mightn't happen. And so, to war. On Sunday, the 21st of April, the Jacobites commenced bombardment of Derry. Cannonballs crashed through the roofs of houses and smashed through their walls.
But while the Jacobite bombardment got underway, it was the Williamites who made the early and decisive military strikes. In the first, Adam Murray saw off a Jacobite attempt to take the strategic village of Pennyburn, a mile north of Derry. His men ambushed the Jacobite cavalry, inflicting heavy casualties on 2 troops of horse. And as the fighting continued over several days, they claimed 2 of James's finest French generals, Maumont and Puissignon.
The Williamites scored some considerable successes very early on. Their success was largely due to the energy, if you like, the leadership given by Adam Murray in particular. And you have French senior officers actually being killed or fatally wounded by the Williamite soldiers. So what you've got is good defensive positions, and above all you've got good leadership and the willingness to take risks, which is what Murray did.
The action soon shifted to Windmill Hill, 500 yards from Bishopsgate. Here, Murray struck again, killing 200 Jacobites and their brigadier, Ramsay.
The siege was only a fortnight old, and already the Williamites had secured 2 major victories. And by the end of May, over 3,000 of James's men had lost their lives. The Jacobite wounded arrived in Dublin and told of the savage fighting in the north. Derry, they said, was James's slaughterhouse.
Although Williamite morale was high, tensions and feuds flourished in the city's hothouse atmosphere, particularly between the Anglicans and the Presbyterians. There was even a sword fight between Governor Henry Baker and John Mitchelburn, the regimental commander, a fight which both men survived. By now, though, the Jacobites were strengthening their positions. After their failures at Pennyburn and Windmill Hill, they regrouped and moved their camps closer to Derry, establishing themselves at Ballochry Hill, Pennyburn Village, and Strong's Orchard. Now the city was totally surrounded and under relentless cannon fire. John Mackenzie, a Presbyterian clergyman who was keeping a diary, recorded how this struck a greater terror into the hearts of the besieged. While the Jacobite cannon induced terror in Derry, their soldiers were suffering badly. Indeed, conditions on the outside of the walls were no better than those on the inside.
This was an extremely wet summer. Some might say it was a fairly typical Derry summer. You've got these Jacobite soldiers who are encamped in sod huts on the hills overlooking the city. So what we've got over the period of the 105 days is 2 armies that are gradually reducing in size, are deteriorating, are suffering malnutrition, lack of ammunition and so forth, and probably feeling very, very sorry for themselves.
The Jacobites also knew that time was not on their side and that a relief force was most likely en route to rescue the Derry garrison. To forestall this, the French engineer, the Marquis de Pointes, built a boom of logs and chains and strung it across the foyle here at Brook Hall. De Pointes also built gun forts which he put at either end of the boom. Any ship attempting to sail to Derry would be caught on the boom and then pummeled mercilessly by guns firing from both sides of the river.
The boom was a valuable aid to the Jacobites' cause, and by the end of May, their situation further improved with the arrival of new artillery. Now they could intensify their bombardment of the city.
With cannonballs raining on the city by day and bombs being lobbed over the walls by night, the defenders in Derry were coming under intense pressure. Shells of 270 pounds were typical. When the metal casing exploded, fragments scattered everywhere, mutilating everyone within range. A long, slow death by septicemia followed.
According to Governor Walker's account, between the 3rd and the 9th of June, 159 bombs were thrown into the city. These induced such terror that the besieged, said Walker, could not enjoy their rest, but were hurried from place to place.
On Monday, the 3rd of June, 7 weeks after the start of the siege, the pendulum appeared to swing back in the defenders' favour. For on that day, 3 advanced ships from the fleet, sent 3 weeks earlier from Liverpool to relieve Derry, were spotted on the foil. Now the Jacobites needed to conclude matters, and fast.
As the relief fleet, under the command of Major General Percy Kirk, sat on the foil, the Jacobite General Richard Hamilton dispatched a force to retake Windmill Hill. But the Williamites quashed its attack. The mood in the Jacobite camp that night was sullen. Once again, the defenders had acquitted themselves better than might have been expected. And so the Jacobites turned to a new weapon. As de Pointes, the French engineer who had built the boom, put it, attacking must no longer be thought of. We shall have to wait on hunger.
De Pointes was right. Behind the walls, food supplies were running low, as were water and fuel. The weather was also unseasonably cold, and disease had begun to rampage through the city. In the face of such adversities, the Williamites clung to hope wherever they could find it. Even the sight of a star in the daytime sky they interpreted as a sign that the rest of Kirk's relief fleet was on its way.
Perhaps, or perhaps not. But sure enough, on the 56th day of the siege, Thursday, the 13th of June, the rest of the fleet was spotted far down the loch. This was a major blow to the Jacobites, who now anticipated a Williamite attempt to lift the siege.
But the Jacobites had an unlikely ally, none other than the commander of the relief fleet, Major General Percy Kirk. Now, had he been a man of different character, had he been more bold, he might have taken advantage of the collapse in Jacobite morale. But unwilling to risk his precious ships on the dreaded boom, he dropped anchor and waited and waited and waited.
It looked as if this was the end. This was a sizable force of professional soldiers come from England to put an end to this siege. And yet this relief fleet sits in Lough Foyle and it seems to do nothing. And it does that because the commander, Major General Percy Kirk, decided that the boom across the river is much, much stronger than it really was.
Kirk would have been understandably reticent about, breaching the boom. That is a cold crumb of comfort to the residents of Derry who are dying of starvation in their hundreds.
For the defenders, who by now had received the last of their weekly rations from Walker, joy turned to dismay at the sight of the ships idling on the foil. As the Presbyterian clergyman, John Mackenzie, wrote in his diary, "When we saw them lie in the loch without any attempt to come up, it cast a cold damp on our too confident hopes, and sunk us as low as we were raised at the first sight of them.
They were told that William had been sent in a relief fleet, but they actually be able to see the fleet gives them much more hope that they will be relieved. It is a very tantalising situation for them to be in. There's hope and despair at the same time.
But despair for the Williamites equalled hope for the Jacobites, as they realised the fleet was not for moving.
Food shortages wreaked havoc in Derry. On June the 18th, a mob even stormed Walker's quarters because they believed he was hoarding food. For the Williamites, it was now more critical than ever that their dire circumstances were known to the ships of the fleet, that they were starving while the boats stalled on the loch. Thankfully for them, a messenger sent by Kirk managed to slip through the Jacobite lines and swim to Derry. For the first time, the governors now had the chance to communicate directly with the fleet and Kirk.
Walker sent the messenger, a man named Roach, back to Kirk and his fleet with a letter describing the perilous circumstances inside Derry's walls. But this time, Roach was not so lucky. He was shot and wounded by the Jacobites and had to turn back to the city.
Another volunteer was needed for the dangerous mission of swimming to the fleet 12 miles away, and a man known to history only as Majimsi stepped forward.
Majimsi set off with 3 letters from Walker to Kirk, wrapped up in a pig's bladder tied around his neck. Their message was stark. If the city wasn't rescued within 6 days, it would have to surrender. Just before dark on the 26th of June, Majimsi slipped into the foyle and swam for the fleet. But he never made it. He drowned during the night, and his body was retrieved by Jacobites.
In a macabre twist, the Jacobites strung up Majimsi's body on a gallows in front of the city walls, there for all to see.
In doing so, they sent a stark and demoralizing message to those inside, that having seized the letters Majimsi was carrying, they knew that the people were starving and close to surrender, and that Kirk and his fleet were still unaware of their plight. Williamite morale suffered another blow with Governor Baker's death from illness on the 30th of June. Now Mitchelburn, with whom Baker had had a sword fight, replaced him as the joint governor of the city. There was also a change of leadership outside the walls, as the Jacobite Lieutenant General Conrad de Rosen returned to Derry. A fierce and resolute soldier, before long he would live up to his reputation for ruthlessness.
Although they had thwarted the city's attempts to communicate with the fleet, its presence on the foyle was still ominous to the Jacobites. Derry must fall before Kirk's ships could reach the city. Knowing the city was on its last legs, Lieutenant General Richard Hamilton made the garrison an offer for its surrender. All who wished to could remain in Derry under his protection. All who wanted to return home could leave freely.
The garrison gave the appearance of considering Hamilton's proposals, but in reality was stalling, holding out for relief from the fleet, whilst its citizens were trying to survive on horseflesh, dogs, cats, rats and mice, all of which had a price. To increase the pressure on the city, Lieutenant General Conrad de Rosen now turned to blackmail. He rounded up Protestants from the surrounding area and drove them, naked and hungry, to Butcher's Gate. His message for the garrison was chilling. Either let your fellow Protestants in, or let them die. Rosen believed the Williamites would open the gates and admit their fellow Protestants, creating mayhem and the fall of the city. But it seems he underestimated the prisoners' resolve. Governor Walker's account of the siege describes how they pleaded with the guards at the gate to resist pity and keep them locked out.
With the city's gates remaining closed and the garrison threatening to hang its Jacobite prisoners, Rosen relented. His plan had failed, and now Derry, according to Walker, warmed with new rage and fury against the enemy. James was appalled by Rosen's tactics and had him recalled to France.
Some historical accounts have mythologized the city's fearless resistance. But whilst its citizens had the will to resist, they no longer had the ability. By now, there was little meat of any description within the city. Likewise, there was virtually no fresh water, while the lanes and streets ran with feces and urine.
Because of the lack of fresh food, because of the overcrowding, you've got an outbreak of disease, and you've got typhus and so forth, various other diseases that are endemic in such crowded situations, which are killing off considerable numbers of the defenders.
As casualties mounted and bodies not only of people but horses are putrefying, so conditions inside and outside the city would have been very poor.
But just as conditions inside Derry were getting critical, the situation took yet another dramatic turn for the worse. From the walls, the defenders watched in despair and disbelief as Kirk's fleet weighed anchor and set sail out of the foyle.
Kirk was moving his ships to Inch Island in Lough Swilly. His plan was to rest his men until further troops came from England. Only once they arrived would Kirk sail to Derry's rescue. But of course no one in the city knew he planned on returning.
When those ships head out of the foyle, it must have been a crushing psychological blow to people who are starving, people who have held out for so long, to think that deliverance at a hand and then they disappear.
Deliverance is within reach, and then it's snatched away again. You know, and this does cause, in the later months of the siege, there are mutinies within the city. Many people within the city want to surrender. They're reduced by famine, they're reduced by disease, they're ill, they're hungry. It's no wonder that some inside the city say we could actually surrender.
Hamilton took the opportunity to press for Derry's surrender. Copies of his offer were smuggled behind the walls, and one copy inside this shell was fired into the city. Hamilton's offer stated that those who accepted his terms could serve James, or if they wished to leave Ireland, they could have free passes. The rest could return to their homes, where they would be free to practice their religion. Hamilton's message was simple: make peace now or face certain death.
Hungry and exhausted, and with the relief fleet gone, the Williamites saw little choice and agreed to talk to the enemy. But while they decided to drag on the negotiations for as long as possible, they also knew that unless support came quickly, they'd have no alternative but to surrender. On Saturday, the 13th of July, all guns fell silent, while the two sides met and talked on Windmill Hill. Meanwhile, Governor Walker took stock. Since his last roll call 5 days earlier, the garrison had lost 207 men to hunger and disease. It now stood at 5,313 men. Disaster was drawing ever closer. But then, into Walker's room appeared a little boy. The truce had enabled him to make his way from the fleet through the Jacobite lines with a letter from Kirk hidden inside his gaiters.
From the letter the boy had carried, Walker learnt of the fleet's move from Derry, over there, to Inch Island, here in County Donegal. He also learnt that Kirk only intended to come once further troop reinforcements had arrived. Walker drafted a reply. The enemy had offered honourable terms. Unless Kirk appeared before July the 26th, the city would have no alternative but to accept those terms and surrender. The letter hidden about his person, the little boy set off to walk back to Inch and the fleet.
You can imagine that as a boy, probably in his early teens, maybe even a little bit younger, would have been able to pass lines of soldiers, simply being seen as a nondescript youngster, even an urchin. But it still required a considerable amount of courage on the boy's part, because if it were known, if it were suspected or discovered that he was a spy, then there was only one likely outcome for that, and that was his immediate death.
I suppose he's this insignificant in some way little figure who nevertheless is so important as a conduit between an increasingly desperate garrison and what they would consider a rather lackluster relief operation.
Inside the walls, Walker now had a dilemma. With Kirk's fleet still at Inch Island and awaiting reinforcements, there was little hope for the starving citizens that they would soon be rescued. And so, to boost morale, Walker amended the letter brought by the little boy, so that it falsely stated that there were already thousands of men at Inch preparing to rescue Derry. This letter was copied and handed out around the city.
On Windmill Hill, negotiations stalled. Hamilton wanted the city's surrender by Monday the 15th of July, but the city's commissioners were holding out for Friday the 26th of July. They agreed to extend the truce and meet the following morning.
Each of them, especially in the later stages, what they're doing is they're dancing around each other. Each one is trying to gain time. The Jacobites, they are aware what happened to the fleet, and the Jacobites are aware that the fleet will come back. And so they know time is running out for them too. Time is running out for the people in the city, is that they might be that weakened that they can no longer defend the city. Powder is running out, supplies are running out. So they're dancing around, they're playing, each of them is playing for that time. They need to bring this to a conclusion.
Derry's commissioners returned to the city and reported Hamilton's demand of surrender. To their surprise, Walker argued that they should comply. But what about the letter from Kirk that the little boy had brought? Why surrender if, as it said, troops were already amassed at Inch? Walker confessed. He had forged the letter. Kirk had no plans to rescue them any time soon. All the city could expect was more hunger and death.
The next day, Sunday, the 14th of July, the Williamites met Hamilton once again, but they could not agree a surrender date. It was stalemate. Frustrated, Hamilton recommenced bombardment almost immediately. For the Williamites, all hope now focused once again on Kirk and the relief fleet.
4 days later, the little messenger boy returned to Derry with another letter from Kirk at the fleet. It offered assurances that he would relieve Derry with troops from Enniskillen and those expected from England. In their reply to Kirk, the joint governors of the city, Walker and Michelburn, wrote that the guns and boom on the foil had gone. It was a lie, as they were still intact. As he made his way back to the fleet with the letter, this time the boy was stopped by Jacobite troops and taken in for interrogation.
However, the little boy told the Jacobites nothing, and 2 days later he appeared in Kirke's camp. Kirke was delighted with the little boy's news. The boom and the guns were gone, and Kirke finally launched the relief operation. The following day, his ships appeared on the Foyle and anchored here off Culmore Point to await a favourable wind before making their final approach to Derry.
But there were few signs of hope or optimism within the city's walls. On Sunday, the 28th of July, the 100th day of the siege, Walker noted that within 2 days, a staggering 435 soldiers had died. They were now down to 4,456 men.
The civilian death rate had also soared. Graveyards, backyards, gardens were packed with bodies, and in the streets there wasn't a dog to be seen. The following day, Walker, who noted the garrison could only exist a further 2 days, preached here in St. Columb's Cathedral. He told his congregation he was confident that God would deliver them, but they must remain true to their faith.
This was the darkest hour for the Williamites, but that evening the wind blew strongly in their favour, and the ships on the Foyle made their move for Derry. Then the wind slackened, leaving only the flood tide to carry the lead ship, the Mountjoy, towards the boom, which, contrary to Walker's assurances to Kirke, was still in place.
The Jacobites fired from both banks of the Foyle, while musketeers returned fire from on board the Mountjoy. Meanwhile, on board a longboat, men frantically chopped at the boom with their axes. And finally, the Mountjoy, carried forward by the tide, struck the chain, which curved like a bowstring, then snapped. The boom was broken. Although the Jacobite guns continued firing, they couldn't stop the Mountjoy from sailing on and reaching the city. The siege was over. Derry had survived.
Thomas Ashe, a soldier, recorded the sense of relief in the city. It was, he said, a day to be remembered with thanksgiving by the besieged in Derry as long as they lived.
Once the fleet were seen arriving at the ship quay, then that was the ultimate message to the Jacobites that this is the end. This is relief. They've got food, they've got ammunition, and they will be able to continue the fight. And for the Jacobite army, there is no other alternative but to strike camp and leave, which is what over the next few days they did.
According to Walker, the garrison lost nearly 3,000 soldiers during the siege. He didn't record the civilian deaths, although estimates put them at between 4,000 and 10,000. The city had paid an enormous price. But by successfully defending its walls, Derry's garrison delivered a strategic victory for William and a devastating blow to James's Jacobite campaign in Ireland.
The Jacobite failure to take the city really meant that the high water mark of James's attempts to regain his throne had passed.
This is a huge victory for the Williamite forces. This is, you know, the maiden city, the Protestant citadel, the plantation citadel remains, you know, secure. Its walls are not breached. So that's of huge psychological and propagandist importance to the Williamite cause.
It's very, very common to say that the significant victory for the Williamites in Ireland was the Battle of the Boyne. The only significance that the Battle of the Boyne had was that the two monarchs were on the battlefield. The Jacobites were finished when they failed to take Derry.
Just 3 days later, as Hamilton's forces prepared to leave Derry, 2,000 Jacobites were slaughtered by Williamites 70 miles south of the city at Newton Butler. A further 500 Jacobites fled into Lough Erne and drowned. And worse was to come for James. William's subsequent victories at the Boyne and Aughrim brought to an end all hope of using Ireland to regain the throne.
But the siege of Derry was more than a defining episode in the power struggle between William and James. It was a bloody and epic fight to the death that was to have an impact not only beyond these walls, but beyond the kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland.
What happened in Derry not only changed Irish history, it changed British history and it changed European history. So that the true significance of those 105 days are much, much broader than just this city. This city played a pivotal part in the history of an entire continent. That history pivoted around the walls of Derry for 105 days in 1689.
But the siege was, above all else, a defining and symbolic moment in the psyche and mythology of Ulster Protestants.
Their sense or perception of being under siege is encapsulated in the story of the siege of Derry. And their cries of no surrender, shouted out from these walls, have echoed down through the centuries. And they can still be heard today.